Autobahn Raser 4 was released for the PlayStation in 2002 and was published by Davalix Entertainment. This company was also responsible for games such as the Knight Rider series, USA Racer and the London Racer series. So if you've ever played any of those games, you will definitely see the similarities in terms of the graphics and visual style. Even many of the environments, assets and locations are often reused in many of these games, so you will be quite familiar. In many cases, a lot of these games would be considered, in today's terms, more asset flip games, as with the reuse of multiple elements. But there are some subtle differences regarding each individual entry within the series of games that are available. Like if we look at even the cars, there isn't a great selection of cars, but they all depict or are kind of modelled and inspired by mainstream classics and brands, while they're not official brands as such, but they all mimic the visual style, but with some subtle differences and changes, just to make them quite unique, but to not appeal for the more mainstream elements. Like when you have the likes of the Mini Cooper, you have a 1978 Opel Kadett Coupe, which in itself today is a very, very rare car, and you don't see many of them on the roads, if any, if you're lucky. You have the Renault Clio V6, a depiction of the Volkswagen Golf, and a couple of other cars that all reflect and resemble different types of racing cars or just street cars that you would see during that time or even before it. And in all honesty, this was no different to many other developers that made racing games. They would all use some sort of depiction or inspiration for various cars, but wouldn't have the brand names associated with them, but they would still look and play and feel very similar to their real life counterparts in some ways. But it was still a cool idea because it did give you the opportunity to play as some of your favourite cars in these games to some degree. So when we look at the locations in the game, it has you racing around different street and city type environments based around Germany, where you race on narrow kind of streetways, tunnels that eventually lead you on to the likes of motorway or bypass sections, and your aim is to pretty much compete in different types of modes, anything from time trials or time attacks all the way through to campaign elements where you have to race against other opponents through the likes of a competition or campaign setting where you either have to avoid the cops or you have to race and beat your opponents in order to progress through the entirety of the game and unlock all of the additional vehicles and tracks that are available within. While playing, you also have the ability to race through each of the sections in the reverse format, which means you will be able to go in an opposite direction as well. And even with all of those additional features, the game in some ways is simple enough in terms of its pick up and play appeal, but just to let you know that these games are very, very difficult. Even on the lowest difficulty settings, it will take some time to get used to the control systems, as while the game is playable, many of these control elements, and I do state this in other videos, even going back to the likes of the PS1 era, with all of these consoles having a boatload of racing games, there's a lot of them out there that still struggle with the likes of the control systems and elements and the handling features of the cars, as the developers were just never able to get that or hit that sweet spot with regards to the handling features of the cars in the games. But there was a few that would stand out, and there was some that were decent at best, but would still require a lot of effort, time and patience and a lot of persistence in order to master the control elements in the games themselves. And in many ways, for the casual player, it would lead to a lot of frustration. And this game is one of those titles that will drive you crazy in many cases, because it definitely warrants some time to put into it just to master all of those features and elements within. But it doesn't take away from it. It's not a bad title. Not the best racing game on the system, but it's not the worst either, even when we look at the multitude that are available. But if you've played one of these type of games, they are very similar in how they present themselves, and like I mentioned, they use a lot of similar features with environments, tracks, cars. So technically, if you have played one, you've played them all. And bear in mind that this game was solely released in Germany and in Europe, so it would have gotten a release in other areas, but it would have been rebranded under a completely different name, but just with some subtle tweaks and changes here and there. But it's an interesting title in its own right for what it does represent. It is a decent enough racer, mind you, it will test you, but once you do get the hang of it, you will be able to master some of the elements, but it does become increasingly difficult the further into the game that you get, especially once you start unlocking some of the track variations. And bear in mind that the handling of each of the cars, while they do slightly differ in terms of each model that you use, the handling is very twitchy and at times can be very unforgiving. That will lead you to crash into multiple elements that can literally destroy your progress, so you have to be aware of your surroundings at all times. So that you have to take into mind also. But it is what it is. These games were never meant to be perfect. A lot of them were experimental titles, to be totally honest, and many of these games, like I said at the start of the video, many of them were more like asset flip games in a way to just make a quick cash grab in many instances, and the PlayStation 2 is no different to that in many respects. But still, if you are into your racing games and you like this era of very obscure but yet experimental titles, then this is just another one of those games that you can try out, because the PlayStation 2, like the PS1 before it, has an absolute ton of them to try out, so you won't get lost in that respect. But regardless, I would love to know your thoughts of Autobahn Racer 4 for the PlayStation, or any variation of these series of games that you've played from this developer, and what do you think of them overall? Do you think they're a worthwhile race or worth checking out, or maybe not so much? I would love to hear what your thoughts are of this game in general, so be sure to shout down in the comments below. And if you would like to see more content around other obscure and experimental games like this were also released on the PS2, make sure to leave a like on the video, subscribe to the channel, and also be sure to check out this playlist here on screen to see more of those games in action. And I will see you all in the next one.